So thank you, Zach, for inviting me to be here, and thank all of you for being here. Most of you are at your homes, and some of you in New York City, and I know there are probably plenty of things you could be doing this evening rather than being here on Zoom listening to me, especially since this is recorded and you could always watch it later. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate always, as I told Zach, the chance to talk about my very favorite subject in the world. And since I retired about a year and a half ago, I don't talk about it quite as much, or at least not in a classroom. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And there are folks in the audience whose names I'm seeing and whom I've said hello to who have heard this before, multiple times even. So thank you doubly for being here. And I will also say to all of you, especially those who may be students or attending this coming of age education program that Zach has beautifully put together, you've been reading, you've been learning in a really intense kind of way last fall and this spring as well. There are things you've learned about Transcendentalism as a philosophy and a theory and a moral and spiritual reform movement. All of that is much fresher in your minds and your learning right now than it is for me. So by all means, during the Q&A, which I'm assuming we'll have plenty of time for, correct me, ask questions if something doesn't sound quite right. If it sounds like I said Emerson when I really meant someone else, please point those things out so that we don't all go, or that all of you don't go home with the wrong message or the wrong name in the wrong spot. I appreciate questions, and I certainly know that I've been doing this research now for a long time, and my book is this year 20 years old, the one that's centered on this movement, which seems kind of impossible, but that is the way it is. And there has been a lot that's come to our understanding that changes, tweaks, nuances, some things that I talked about. Certainly some of the wording and language that we use when we talk about slavery and enslaved people has changed. So I'm very aware of that. And I want to make sure that I remain up to date in the way that I talk about this material with you. So if there's something that I am discussing tonight, or an incident or a letter that there's something else that's come out that's now in the public domain that sort of complicates the way that I talk about something, then let's bring that up into the Q&A and let's have that as for a discussion. Tonight, I'm going to largely talk to you about part one. As he said, I'll be here next week, and next week's the really cool stuff as far as I'm concerned, as we hit 1850 and move into that last really volatile decade before the Civil War. But tonight, we're going to be building and getting to the point where the radicalization, I would say, of the Transcendentalists in Concord, whom we most associate with Emerson and Thoreau, where that really had begun to take effect. By 20 years, 15 years, we were getting to that place. If you see me looking over to the side every once in a while, I apologize, but I've got two monitors up, and so I need to make sure that I'm on the right slide, talking about the one that you're actually seeing right now. So tonight we're going to be in the early 1830s to start things, and then move up to about 1850. I like to make it clear when I start talking on this subject that mine, from the start, was a very, to me, basic kind of book. I didn't want to do high theory. I wasn't writing a psychological kind of investigation about people's motives and behaviors. I simply wanted to answer some basic questions that I thought somebody should have answered by now. And writing my dissertation and writing the annotations that went with my dissertation, none of the professors that I approached with these questions could answer them. They said I'd have to piece the story together because it wasn't in only one place. That was very frustrating to me as a student. And so I have tried, with the questions I asked, to make something available to people who do find this subject as interesting as I did. So again, very basic questions. The book answers some of these in a lot more detail, more thoroughly than others. But this is what I wanted to find out about. I initially, very naively, thought I could write a book investigating all of the fugitive slaves who came to Concord. What were their names? When did they stay there? Why were they there? Or how long were they there? Became pretty apparent pretty quickly that those kinds of records were seldom kept for darn good reasons, as we certainly even can know today that those records aren't always being kept. And so instead, it became a book that began to realize that what I'd always thought about the Underground Railroad in Concord, Massachusetts, was really quite different from the message that we're usually looking at. Because this was the message. Concord went down in the history books and the biographies of its most famous two sons, Thoreau and Emerson, as a hotbed of anti-slavery. Why was it a hotbed of anti-slavery? Because these two guys were really well known and gave pretty famous speeches. Well, Thoreau wasn't terribly well known in his time, but he became well known for his anti-slavery speeches by the time all of us were in college and high school. So this is what I thought I was writing about. Emerson, Thoreau gave these killer speeches, especially by the 1850s, on anti-slavery. And why? Because they were transcendentalists. They were nature people. They were in the clouds, philosophical, spiritual eyeball people, transparent eyeballs, not spiritual eyeballs. What made them care about abolition? What made them care about a social movement when I knew that their focus was primarily on the individual? What I learned in researching this subject was that, in fact, it wasn't just Thoreau and Emerson who were the abolitionists in Concord. It was actually a complete community, largely a group of women who were inspiring them, motivating them, prodding, goading, use the verb of your choice, but who eventually persuaded them that they had to take the responsibility of those reputations and those moral slogans much more than the individual. They had to take them out into the world. And eventually that's what happened, of course. So Concord anti-slavery town is really a much more appropriate subject for anything that we talk about when it comes to abolition in the town of Concord. Slavery had been abolished in all of the northern states for quite some time. By the early 1830s, the start of our conversation tonight, as such, Northerners could just conveniently ignore it if they chose, especially when their economics was so closely tied into that industry and the need for ready cotton to run those textile mills. A newspaper editor named William Lloyd Garrison had spent some time in jail already in Baltimore for the refusal to ignore it any longer. And he decided to move back to Boston. He grew up and was born in Newburyport, so he was familiar with Massachusetts and had friends in Boston. He began publishing very symbolically and on purpose on New Year's Day in 1831. An anti-slavery weekly that then came out every single week for the next 30 years. Its last issue would be only after the Civil War ended on December 29th, 1865. It was the longest running newspaper dedicated to anti-slavery ever. Garrison was someone who was brash, who definitely did not believe in being a pacifist when it came to his rhetoric, even though that was his approach to anti-slavery. He did not mince words at all, and his approach was something that was brand new, revolutionary, and had not been the kind of more calm and moderate anti-slavery writings that we'd had in Boston and elsewhere. Not only did he call for an immediate end to slavery and for a pacifist revolution, he believed that it needed to be completely free from the political landscape. The politics of the United States were clearly pro-slavery and had been since the origin of the country. So he didn't vote. He called on his movement instead to be one of bringing the moral wrong of slavery to the forefront of everyone's living room as they read his newspaper. He very intelligently lifted text from Southern papers, showing the mistreatment, the runaways, the for sale ads of human trafficking, and put that down in his newspaper so that Northerners couldn't say that they didn't know, and so forth. But the most revolutionary thing he did, according to many people, was call women to have a leadership role in this movement. Now, if you remember anything about the 1830s, you'll no doubt remember that women did not have a political identity. They did not speak in public on political subjects to mixed audiences, mixed meaning men and women both in the crowd. And yet Garrison said that's exactly who should be leading his movement and speaking to these people, because women were regarded at this time, especially in New England social circles and religious circles, as being more spiritually and morally refined and attuned than men were. Men had to go out into the public world of commerce and dirtying themselves when it came to ethical decision making. And so it was women's job. Their more refined moral nature naturally put them in charge of this movement. Not only that, they needed to bring the true nature of slavery's mistreatment and abuse of their enslaved Black sisters to bear as well. That wasn't a popular taboo, really, not popular, but completely taboo topic to talk about. But he and others certainly brought it up anyway. Women jumped at the chance to begin having a political identity. Lydia Maria Child, Maria Stewart, Sarah Mapps Douglas were already speaking on other subjects. Sarah Mapps Douglas is an educator. Lydia Maria Child, absolutely popular writer already, thrilled to add anti-slavery to what they were talking to people about. As you are no doubt not surprised, there were plenty of conservatives, ministers, politicians, men and women, but largely men, who didn't think women needed to be in this political public sphere at all. How were women supposed to influence the anti-slavery topic if this was something they felt called to do? These men would say they should bring their ability to influence their sons, their fathers, their husbands, make them aware of anti-slavery's benefits and the need for justice, but not be out there dirtying themselves and speaking in public on their own. In fact, one Boston minister, Reverend Nehemiah Adams, said that it would completely unsex a woman were she to take on this role. They said all kinds of ridiculous things, none of which surprise us, the sorts of things that we probably, some of us still hear recorded in places in 2026 that we find pretty hard to believe. But these were the ways in which women were threatened and not encouraged, I guess is a nice way to put it, to continue this sort of identity. Not surprisingly, women who took very seriously and felt the importance of this role continued to ignore those sorts of injunctions against them. Two such women who were very important to what happened in Concord are Angelina and Sarah Grimke. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of them before. They had grown up on a large agricultural plantation outside Charleston, Charleston, South Carolina, and knew very well the truth of everything William Lloyd Garrison and others were saying about the wrongs of slavery. They had immigrated to Philadelphia. They had become Quakers. And when William Lloyd Garrison called women to join his movement and take on leadership roles, they were only too happy to do so. And 1837 was sort of a whirlwind speaking year for them as they joined Garrison's American anti-slavery movement, and they started speaking throughout the country. They came to Concord for several days, almost a week, in early 1837. We've got records of them speaking in the Emerson's house, having a reception at the church, speaking in Groton and Acton, but still coming back and being the overnight guests of Mary Merrick Brooks and her husband, Nathan. So they were very influential then in the decision of at least 60 women, a few more. We don't have all of the names. We have many of them who decided that it was time for Concord to have its own individual female anti-slavery society. Concord was a little late to that game, so I want us to appreciate, on the one hand, always through everything that we learn about the anti-slavery abolitionist movement, these were a group of really radical extremists, we would call them today. We can't ever see these women or people like Garrison as being part of a popular movement or something that gained credibility. A little bit here and there, yes. But in the 1830s, as much as 1859, these were still a minority of Northerners, a minority of people. There had been lots of female anti-slavery societies already formed, not only in Massachusetts, but throughout the northern states. Hingham, Boxbury, Groton, I think it was, all of those towns near Concord formed a female anti-slavery society before Concord did. But what Concord had been doing was attending the Middlesex County anti-slavery meetings. That society had formed in 1834, and women of Concord were attending that and eventually taking on leadership positions. And so it hadn't really become the necessity to them to form their own society. After the Grimkes were there and really feeling impelled and urged to do that, then Lydia and Emerson, the Thoreau aunts and sisters in Henry's family, and others decided that we needed to have our own society. And as you can also see from Susan Garrison's picture in the middle of the slide here, it was a biracial group from the beginning, with at least Susan Garrison and a couple of the younger people in her family eventually joining the society as well. If you haven't been to Concord and checked out the Robbins House, I urge you to do that if you're ever there, or on some of you who are here this week are students, I think, of Zach's, and hopefully you'll be visiting Concord soon and you're able to visit that home. Then you'll learn a great deal about Susan Garrison and her family, and the African-American history of Concord. These women, I don't have a particular woman's photo on this slide because Mary Merrick Brooks gets her own. She's going to be our star tonight. We won't hear that much from her next week, but during the 1830s and 1840s, she was the voice of really everything that was happening in Concord on the abolitionist subject at this time. For the longest time, Mary Merrick Brooks was known to me visually through only this painting that is at the Concord Museum. More recently, however, just within the last year, maybe year and a half, these two actual photos of her have come to light. Not that they were in a place where no one knew they were, in Amherst College archives, but they were in a collection that had not really risen to anyone's attention in Concord when I was doing my research, or that anyone else told me about. So when I unearthed these and contacted the archivist, and she, corroborated that, yes, this is Mary Merrick Brooks. We're pretty sure this one is. What do you think about this one? It was a really exciting moment. So as I said at the very beginning, my research is 20 years old now. There's new stuff, not only letters and materials and information, but visual images too. So it's really, really exciting for me that we can actually look at the real person here in addition to her youthful painting. This woman is a Concord native, the daughter of Sally Minot and Tilly Merrick. Tilly Merrick, her father, had actually lived in South Carolina for a time and been an enslaver himself. Business didn't go well, and eventually had to sell things and move back to Concord, and I think opened a dry goods shop, some kind of a drugstore, and then maintained life in a very different fashion from what he had been doing. Whether that influenced and impacted Mary Merrick Brooks's commitment, I don't know, but I think whatever she committed herself to, she would have been the zealous, in-your-face, kind of take no prisoners woman that we are going to hear from in a minute in some of her correspondence. I used to tell students when I talked about her that Mary Brooks was the kind of woman you probably didn't necessarily want as a neighbor, but she was darn sure what you wanted for the leader of your community activist effort. And let's see some examples of what it was she did. What did the women do? First of all, we have a Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. So what? What does that mean? What did the women in all of these anti-slavery societies do that was so important? They did a lot of different things, frankly, and some of their societies were more successful than others. They were super competitive with each other. And so if you had a Mary Merrick Brooks in your town, or you had a Francis Drake in Leominster, or you had a Mariah Weston Chapman in Boston, you were going to be hoping that Concord or Leominster or Boston or Worcester, your society was the place that got the most important speakers on the biggest holidays of the year. Or when Garrison and the Liberator ran the monthly or semi-annual reports on the treasurer's records showing which anti-slavery societies had raised how much money to contribute to his coffers, they wanted Concord to look like it had donated the most, or they wanted, whatever society they were. So these were public societies with their planning, with their hosting of gatherings and events, and again, with their fundraising. This information was constantly in the Liberator. Remember, this paper is coming out 4 full-size large pages every single Friday. He needed copy as much as anything. And so having this information, announcements, and keeping the females anti-slavery societies in the public eye was constant for him. They held fundraisers to raise money to help support Garrison's effort. These anti-slavery speakers, they were called agents, they were paid, some of them more than others, when they were doing all of the traveling and going throughout the northern cities and communities to raise the anti-slavery consciousness. The women signed petitions. They distributed petitions, and this wasn't brand new work for them. They had been doing this with the Cherokee Removal Act and other actions that preceded the anti-slavery effort. So they had some experience in this. They also had experience with what had been, in Concord at least, called the Female Charitable Society. But all of these local communities, the women had fundraising efforts and charity maneuvers, sewing societies, and so forth. So the anti-slavery was bigger and more important and national and eventually international, but it certainly drew on some of the same skills that these women had already been busy developing. Mary Merrick Brooks might have known she had an interest in talent and writing. Her young, youthful letters that are in the Concord Library don't show much more than a woman who was interested in talking about her beaux and her active social life, but she had an incredible talent when it came to writing letters that today we might call propaganda, the persuasive tactics, the strategies, the use of self-deprecation. We would call them feminine wiles, the ways in which women had to cast things and ask for things and flatter the men they were writing to in those days. She had it all down. Charm, flattery, whatever it took, this woman could absolutely nail the writing. She was absolutely not going to take no for an answer when it came to even writing these important people. Ralph Waldo Emerson was her neighbor, not super close, but close enough that, they could walk to each other's home and she could, pound on his door yet one more time. Why haven't you signed the petition? Why haven't you said you're not going to speak at this place I've told you shouldn't be speaking? And it mattered. He eventually began naming her as the reason he made certain decisions. So she definitely began to have an influence. Why do we have her letters? Why are they preserved? And what do we get out of them? We don't have that many letters, unfortunately, of Mary Merrick Brooks, but the two collections that are the largest are those she wrote to this man, Wendell Phillips, who was like the lieutenant to William Lloyd Garrison. He was the eloquent, excellent speaker, Boston lawyer, and William Lloyd Garrison was the rhetorician and editor, who he spoke in public too sometimes, but not nearly as often or as well as Wendell Phillips. So we have in his collection many letters from Mary Merrick Brooks writing to him, and then in Emerson's letters at Harvard University's Houghton Library, we have her letters to Waldo and also to his wife Lydian. We also have many of her letters back and forth to this woman, Maria Weston Chapman, who was the leader of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. She was the person really that Mary Brooks models herself on. She wants to have that much power and that much authority. And she writes to her often, bearing her soul in the trials and tribulations of working for a cause where you don't feel like you're making any headway at all. And in the early years, they didn't. By the mid-1840s, 10 years after they had been at this work, the churches had closed their doors and weren't allowing any of their speakers anymore because they had become too radical. So she had plenty of reasons. They all did many years after Garrison's newspaper started its publication to feel that there just wasn't anything going forward, and what could they do to make something more apparent to the enslavers of the country. But what I'd like to do now is show you some excerpts. I've said she's these things: flattering, charming, persistent, pushy, and so forth. So don't take my word for it. Let's look at some of her letters. She writes to Wendell Phillips constantly, and we're in the 1840s at this point. I've jumped forward through the 1830s. The society's formed in 37, so we're 6 or 7 years past that when her letters are really confidently pouring out to Wendell Phillips. She apologizes quite often, and then she continues right after the apology to ask for the favor. I want you to speak to us. No one speaks as well as you do. Mr. Frost thinks you must have, you must be using some kind of witchcraft because all the women are constantly following you. This isn't just any Mr. Frost. This is Reverend Barzillai Frost of the First Church in Concord. At this point, he's absolutely tired of the Wendell Phillips, harsh, insistent language, and the church is closed to those speakers. She's hoping that they share the same sense of passion. Otherwise, you might not want to come speak again, but I'm still going to ask you to. Again, I'm excerpting quite long letters, and the full context of the letter you would appreciate far more, the kinds of just gems that I've pulled out. But I think you get a sense of the spirit of what she's going for here. This is later. I've jumped forward, but I wanted you to see the way in which she immediately sets out the fact that this can't possibly be true. I already have my plans in place. You can't be reneging on us and not coming when you said you were going to come. So I trust it's entirely without foundation. Mary Merrick Brooks we've jumped back, of course, to the chronology I was in. I'm sorry for that. Mary Merrick Brooks is almost surely the reason that Frederick Douglass first spoke in Concord in 1841. She had met him at an anti-slavery meeting of the county in Groton when the Middlesex County Anti-Slavery Society had one of its regional meetings there. And the first time he came to Concord was in October 1841. He spoke there at least twice more in 1844, and perhaps other times that we simply don't know about. She was very aware of what a draw he was and how important a speaker he was becoming, and absolutely the competition to have him, to have Phillips, to have Garrison speaking in the communities. She's always anxious to have the best, the most inspiring, the most noteworthy, because not only would it bring attention to her cause for these men to speak in Concord, but she well knew that the Liberator would then publish their speeches, and Concord would be getting the credit for where they had been when they gave that speech. And that was as important to her as anything else. She was very, very marketing driven when it came to Concord and when it came to the female society. We moved to a series of anti-slavery gatherings, events that were very important starting in the early 1840s. Forgive my dog back there. She's unable to be in a different room most of the time, so my apologies for that distraction. Great Britain had abolished slavery in its West Indian territories and colonies in 1834. So the abolitionists were all too happy to point out to the American political leaders that England, Great Britain, had actually taken the moral high road when it came to slavery. Obviously, American politicians did not like having Great Britain compared to them in any way that made Britain look the more moral or more successful country. So the abolitionists had begun celebrating or turning not only July 4th into an anti-slavery rally day, but also August 1st, so that they would be celebrating the end of slavery somewhere and reminding their audiences that it still had not occurred in the U.S. The 10th anniversary of West Indian emancipation in August 1844 then was going to be especially important as a 10th anniversary. The Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society, under the leadership of Mary Brooks, was intent on on hosting a gathering that day in Concord and having it be the biggest and therefore have the best speakers. They had already got invited Ralph Waldo Emerson, local boy, certainly an important figure. But at this point, 1844, Emerson hadn't yet accepted the mantle of abolitionist speaker to the extent that Mary Brooks and the other women, including the women in his home, wanted him to be. He was still hesitant, pretty calm, pretty tepid when he talked about the subject at all. If we know anything about these men, these transcendentalist men in Concord, especially Emerson, they believe in self-reform, self-culture, perfect the individual. Only then will society be ready to be perfected. That's the way to bring social change about, is to have all of these individuals individually working toward perfection. Then society can be reformed. There was a wing of Transcendentalists in Boston that was more of the Unitarian ministers that were never really part of Emerson's focus on the individual. The associationist wing of William Henry Channing and Theodore Parker and a few others had always thought that social collective action was going to be the strategy of social reform. So at this point, the Female Anti-Slavery Society is definitely glad that Emerson has decided he will speak on their August 1st celebration in 1844. But as you can see here, Mary Brooks is still fired up to try and get other speakers, people that she believes at that time will be better speakers. That's the perception of other abolitionists too. Anne Warren Weston, an abolitionist in Boston, who's the sister of Maria Weston Chapman, she's writing to Wendell Phillips, "Are you going to speak in Concord that day?" please do. Mrs. Brooks is going to be having a fit if you're not there because she needs good speakers. We've got Emerson, we've got a few others, but we need better speakers than that to be in Concord that day. Interesting thing was going on too. Since it's 1844, remember, the churches aren't opening any doors to these abolitionists anymore. So the announcement for the event is in the paper every week. But as you can see here at the bottom of this announcement, it's saying that the location will be announced later. Well, the ad ran every Friday for about 4 weeks, the announcement did, and it never said where it was going to be held because they didn't know right up to the last minute. They didn't have a place to host this gathering that they were inviting all these important people to come speak at. Even the day before, a local Concord woman, Sarah Ripley, is telling friends, I don't know where it's going to be. I don't know where Emerson's going to speak because they can't find anyone who will let them in. The old manse in Concord at the time was tenanted by Nathaniel Hawthorne and his wife Sophia, who were absolutely no friends of the abolitionists. But being neighborly, they said they would be fine if their massive, huge lawn was used for the anti-slavery event. And that was a last minute decision that maybe that could work. Unfortunately, rain put an end to that the next day. And so one write-up of the event by Ann Whiting says that the Female Anti-Slavery Society took the courthouse at the last moment. And that's where Emerson ended up giving what turned out to be a 2.5-hour address, definitely considered his coming out speech as an abolitionist. Mary Merrick Brooks was absolutely elated that Ralph Waldo Emerson spoke that long on the subject of slavery. It was a historical speech, largely based, as the subject would make sense that it was, based on slavery in the West Indies and counseling patients for American slavery to soon follow. But there was no doubt that he was now aligned with the organization that had invited him. So much so, I've moved on to the next slide now, that a year later in 1845, Mary Brooks had gotten Emerson to accept the invitations to be part of her movement, and she was going to keep him there, absolutely. And what I'm going to do now is just show you the way in which the Female Anti-Slavery Society under Mary Brooks's leadership has now become more of an understood situation politically among a larger group of people. It's no longer just Concord that her reputation is taking place, but also in the surrounding communities as well. Her ability to be the influential figure when it came to Ralph Waldo Emerson has really become important. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was a popular lecturer, not only in Concord, but throughout the region. And he spoke annually at the New Bedford Lyceum's Winter Lecture Series, and certainly was on track to be doing it the year of 1845. And yet, when it was decided by the New Bedford Lyceum curators to pass a, absolutely racist segregated seating policy, Blacks were going to be seated in the balcony with whites in the main space of the Lyceum, completely upset the abolitionists who had never seen anything like this in New Bedford. In fact, the New Bedford community had been very welcoming and certainly proud of the community's reform spirit. So for this to pass, and 2-to-1 vote, Caroline Weston, again, another Weston abolitionist sister who lived in New Bedford, was apoplectic. What could they do? Well, the first thing she thought of doing was to look at the schedule of the people who were on track to speak at the Lyceum that year. And when she realizes Waldo Emerson is there, she knows that's one that she might be able to change and have him cancel his lecture. How can she do that? She makes Mary Brooks aware of the situation? Can you talk to Waldo? Can you talk to Mr. Emerson and convince him to cancel? This is the 2nd of November then that she is letting Wendell Phillips, the abolitionist, in Boston, know that she's done this. She's also asking him for advice. Is there anything else we should do? Well, it worked. Took a couple of weeks. Who knows how quickly Mary Brooks got that letter or how long it took her to talk to Emerson about it. 2 weeks seems a bit of a lag, but other things were going on, no doubt, that brought it to his attention. I'm sure Emerson thought about it at length as well, considered it from every angle before making the decision that he was going to write to the Lyceum director and cancel. I've learned what you're doing with the segregated seating policy. I'm surprised, and there's no way that I can speak before your society. Doesn't the director doesn't try to talk him out of it, writes back right away, sorry that this is your decision, but we understand. So no effort to try and say that, well, we're rethinking this policy, not at all. 19th of December, or excuse me, November. So just again, a day later, things are going fast and furious now. Mary Brooks is writing to Caroline Weston. I've done what you asked. I made him acquainted with the new policy, and I think he's going to write to Mr. Roch. I think it's going to happen. And she also wants to convey to Wendell Phillips that she's written to Mary Brooks and that this is in process. What we learn here that we didn't from her previous letter is that it was Wendell Phillips who actually advised her to write to Mary Brooks in the first place. I find that very revealing because it wasn't just the female Anti-Slavery Society members, woman to woman, aware of the other's power or potential influence. It was really about the number 2, number 3 abolitionist in the country, Wendell Phillips, aware of the influence of Mary Brooks with Ralph Waldo Emerson. That's really a significant, feather in her cap. By the 24th, she's able to report to Caroline Weston, and you can see from the italics, she is totally thrilled with the fact that she can report that she has done this. She has brought this kind of influence and decision-making to Mr. Emerson, and he is not going to speak in New Bedford. She then, of course, thanks him, making sure that he knows how grateful she and the women are that he's made this decision. As we move on to Mary Brooks's pleas with Waldo Emerson, again, she's been successful in bringing him in to the fold, and the poor guy must have been really tired of those knocks on the door, but she was not going to let him go. By the mid-1840s, William Lloyd Garrison's slogan had become "No union with slaveholders." It was called the Disunion Movement, and his point was, we've been at this anti-slavery effort, this newspaper and moral suasion movement for over a decade, and slavery is only growing. Domestic slaves are growing in number. The political situation has brought no change, that's for sure. And so at the very least, what the northern states should do is sever their relationship and dissolve the Union by the North seceding from the South. And you might say, well, how is that supposed to happen? And why have I never heard about this? Never heard about it because it didn't happen, but that didn't mean that it wasn't a rhetorical strategy, a symbolic movement, and something that was scary in the way it sounded. It was attention grabbing, and that was always Garrison's attempt. What did he do? He gave petitions to the female Anti-Slavery Society heads and wanted them to start getting signatures throughout their communities of people who would support such a movement. This was a very different, radical petition from simply distributing through the community an anti-slavery petition, as you might imagine. And so the reason I put this in front of us just to talk about it is that it's the only letter that I've found anyway where Mary Brooks mentions her husband. She's talked about other men in the community in other petition drives, talked about the minister, talked about Mr. Hoare thinking that witchcraft has been at the heart of what Wendell Phillips is doing. But in this letter, we actually she's talked about who else won't sign and what the minister thought about it. He thought it was a very silly thing, the minister as well. And she uses the same word with her husband, but she also says he treats it with contempt, thinks me, his wife, a very silly woman, etc. Now, thought I, Mr. Emerson must be applied to. The rest of this letter to Waldo goes on flattering him with every single kind of accolade she could. She didn't get anywhere with him. He didn't sign it. So then she writes to his wife, Lydian, her friend, fellow member of the Female Anti-Slavery Society, thinking, well, maybe she can bring her influence to bear, and that Mr. Emerson will sign if she just makes him all the more aware that this is the right thing to do. He never signed this petition, or if he did, it certainly hasn't come to light with any of the published versions that appeared in the Liberator later on. The abolitionists had begun worrying about the Mexican War about to break out. So this follows on the heels of the New Bedford Lyceum situation. They knew that if the independent Republic of Texas at that time was annexed and became a state, as it had in 1845, that as you can see in red here, that the geographical footprint of slavery was going to double. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. In the 2 years of the Mexican War, that was the absolute fear of abolitionists. It was the worry, and it was what led Henry Thoreau, of course, to make a principled statement as well. So where are we? We're in a Mexican War. We're 15 years after the Liberator has been publishing the anti-slavery message. We've got Waldo Emerson. Mary Brooks is pretty happy. He's speaking. He's increasingly radical. I think we could use that word. I think she would feel that it was that way as well. He was increasingly aware that slavery was not going to contentedly stay removed from the Northerners' point of concentration and concern. And what about that young man, Henry Thoreau? What happened to him? Well, he did something that Emerson thought was mean, skulking, and in bad taste. He spent a night in jail because he didn't believe in paying taxes to a pro-slavery government. Big deal, right? One night in jail, so what? Everyone else didn't join him, which is what he thought should happen if it was really going to be an important movement. But what did he do about that? He didn't just leave it at, okay, I spent a night in jail. No, instead, he took some inspiration, I think, from family members, from friends, and then wrote a statement to explain to the Waldo Emerson's friends of the world, to explain to others in Concord who thought it was a ridiculous action, why he did it, and what meaning it could have. How were his sisters and friends protesting the Mexican War? Well, they were putting their names in print on an anti-slavery pledge. This was an unbelievably public action for women to be taking. A couple of things are important here on petitions like this, on pledges like this that appear in a public forum. Any rosters like this that had been publicly available, been published in the past, had been in gendered columns, women's names in one column, men in another. That began to change at this time. The other interesting thing that you see is that the married women, like Mary Brooks, is listed under her name, Mary M. Brooks, not Mrs. Nathan Brooks. It's Cynthia Thoreau, not Mrs. John Thoreau, in almost all of these petitions. That's an important change as the women's rights movement is getting underway and gaining more attention at this time, that these petitions are starting to be far more individualized and feminized, we would say, if that's the right verb to use. I'm not sure it is for this action. A lot has been written on this. Couple of books on petitioning. One especially good book by, I think her name's Susan Zaysky, if you're interested in learning more about this. The other thing that I think is significant as we think about Thoreau's famous essay, Civil Disobedience, is where he was and under whose influence, not just knowing that his sisters and his mother and others in his extended family home were signing pledges and talking against the Mexican War and coming up with all of the reasons that that war was wrong. He was, when he left Walden Pond, living again in the Emerson home as a stand-in father, as handyman, helper, friend, while Ralph Waldo Emerson went to Europe on an extended speaking tour. So Henry is starting to think that he wants to write about this night in jail. He wants to speak at the Lyceum and talk to his townsmen to explain why he did this, why he wasn't paying that tax, and what it mattered to him as he started living in the home of a woman who was one of the first abolitionists in Concord to form the Anti-Slavery Society. I can't imagine that this essay, that certainly is critically important for the action that an individual person should take when he's in the midst of living in being governed by an unjust institution. I can't believe that he wasn't influenced completely by the civic context, the community, both personal, familial, domestic, and so forth, that surrounded him at the time. It was an important, crucially earth-shattering essay. At the time, it did not generate a lot of attention, except some criticism. He gave two different versions of the lecture that became the published essay to the Concord Lyceum in early 1848. It was published in 1849. It has had far more influence in the 20th century and to us today in the 21st century than it ever did in his own time. If you would all join me in jail, if it wasn't just me sitting here, if it wasn't just me refusing to pay my poll tax, maybe then we'd get some attention. Maybe then the political situation would change. We'll be talking next week about that phrase, the higher law, and what exactly that meant, especially as we get back to talking about the transcendentalism and transcendentalist involvement in the abolitionist fight. And I will also draw your attention to that last line, I quietly declare war with the state. This is where Thoreau is in writing his anti-slavery position in 1849. What we're going to do next week in the 1850s is see how that changes, how it's a progression to different kinds of language and different kinds of willingness to accept what might need to be a more violent situation. Civil disobedience is absolutely an example of describing his nonviolent disobedience to a government. But it's an essay that also throughout contradicts itself, promotes various kinds of approaches to social reform, but it absolutely always, in my reading anyway, has the germ of what becomes a much more radical sensibility and philosophy and a much greater ability to accept the possibility that it won't be a nonviolent situation that finally leads to the end of slavery. So next week, I've been talking a lot about what happens next week while we're still talking about the 1840s, but I'll show these slides again. This is where we're going to start next week with a group of people in Boston who did involve Concord people. What was the Underground Railroad like in Concord? What do we know about that? Probably a lot more that we don't know, but that's where we'll be, and I'll definitely show those two slides again.